Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alamin. Assalatu wassalamu anbiya mursalin. Allahumma salli ala Sayyidina Muhammad Fatih lima khuliq wal khati lima sabak nasrul haq bihaq wa hadila suratul mustaqim wa ala alihi aqdaril azim. Alhamdulillah. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi ta'ala wabarakatuh everyone. Wherever you are, in the morning, evening, afternoon, and of course night in Nusantara in our Southeast Asia region. Alhamdulillah. Praise be to Allah. Welcome to another online event at South Ilahi. And tonight we have someone who is a very interesting researcher, someone who I always enjoyed reading his book. And alhamdulillah, due to pandemic, we met online, mashallah. And somehow I always wanting to meet. He is none other than Professor Joseph Hill. Before we begin this conversation on his interesting book, I'd like to talk about him, a bit about him, so that those viewers watching, inshallah, you know about him a bit, inshallah. Joseph Hill is an associate professor of anthropology at the University of Alberta with a research focus on Islam, especially Sufi mystical Islam in contemporary West Africa and globally. Some of the themes of his research include the performance of religious authority, forms of knowledge and experience, gender, and religious expressive performance such as chant and music. Since 2001, his field research has primarily examined a global Islamic movement, the Faida Tijani, or the spiritual lineage of Sheikh Ibrahim Nias with the Tijani Sufi order, right? So we're gonna discuss about his one of the blessed book that I had been reading for the past few months. Inshallah, we go into these details. It's interesting books on women in Sufism, not only in Sufism, but also the development of society, which we all need to really pay attention to why it is important and the role of women in our society. So let us welcome Professor Joseph Hill. Assalamualaikum, Prof. How are you?
Oh, Waalaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Thank you for inviting me. It's really good to see you, Khalid, and to be part of this broadcast. This is a very special opportunity for me, and I'm very happy to be here. And assalamu alaikum to everyone who's listening now and watching now, and who might be watching or listening at any point in the future.
MashaAllah. We are very honored to have you on board tonight. Of course, Singapore right now is night, and you
Mm.
are in the morning.
Yeah,
And I'm sure there are people in some parts of the world in the evening and afternoon. MashaAllah. Alhamdulillah.
inshallah.
And it is something that I like to discuss, which is important in dealings with women and Sufism. And all the time, there's always something that we wanted to understand certain culture and how important the woman play, right? So I would like to ask you first, in regards to this book. So for all those people, for all those viewers who are watching us now live, uh, when the first time I saw this book, I was really mesmerized because I've been to Medina by 4 times in Senegal, staying with my Sheikh Mahin Sisi, may Allah preserve him. And I saw the other side of the world, how women are being treated and how women play I would say, integral role in developing society. So when I saw this book, I was very excited. And alhamdulillah, we have Warda Books in Singapore are selling this book.
Mm.
That's how I get hold of this book.
Mm.
And mashallah, and I really recommend those who are watching, and even those who are not able to watch, you can those who are watching, sorry, can recommend your friend to read this. There's so much things that we can draw from this, inshallah. So, Prof, first and foremost, how do you get into working? I mean, I believe that you love your job, and
Mm-hmm.
I also love
Yeah.
the job because I also love Sufism. And
Mm-hmm.
but I think what enticed me is that the work that you do with this book actually. How is it started? How do you end up in Medina Bay? And did you started the first time, or you came few times, visit few times in Medina Bay before you start this book? Yeah.
Yeah, so this is a very good question, and in fact, it was a very roundabout thing. I didn't start when I went to Medina Bay. I did not have an interest in women leaders and women in Islam at all. And in fact, I had very little. I didn't even know there was such a thing. I didn't know it existed, and maybe that's what really captivated me about this topic was that it was so new to me. I had no idea that it existed, and so, and actually, when I went to Senegal at first, I went as an undergraduate student in 1998, and I
Inshallah.
went to study music. I went to study the khalam and the kora, these traditional instruments. And I was really just interested in traditional music. And I found that most Senegalese people were not that all that interested in traditional music. So I couldn't really have a conversation with people about that. And I was interested in just having conversations with people. And I found that what most people were interested in conversing about was Islam. That was the easiest topic to talk about, especially because everybody I knew was a member of some tariqah,
Mm.
whether they had been formally initiated or not, but everyone believed that everyone considered that they had a sheikh who they followed. And they were all very proud of their sheikh, and they all had a very strong relationship and identification with them. So I told myself, well, if you really want to be an anthropologist and study what people are themselves preoccupied with, which is what I think anthropology should be about, maybe you should be studying Islam. So I chose an Islamic movement to study that, within the context of Senegal, at least, had not been studied all that much by anthropologists or academics in general. Because a lot of people had talked about the Muridiya, which is a Senegalese Sufi tariqa, and they had spoken as if Murids comprised the whole majority, the majority or all of Senegalese, as if they represented Senegalese. And so I said I want to study something a little different. So when I went back, so I decided, well, why not study the Nyas branch of the Tijaniya, which was called in the literature the Nyasen. And when I got there, it was only after I got there that I discovered that they don't call themselves Nyasen. It's other people that call them Nyasen. They call themselves Faida Tijaniya people. So when I got to Medina Bay, and I got there with the help of Usman Khan, the son of Sheikha Maryam, and who invited Usman Khan invited me to his to give a talk in Boston a few months ago, and I was able to see his mother there, alhamdulillah. So I was not a Muslim. I was not interested in religious things at all, really, when I started my research in Senegal. But I said, well, Senegalese people are interested in Islam, so maybe I should study Islam. So when I went there in 2001 to Senegal, to Medina Bay, my first day there was the day of the Molid, of the Gamu. And so there were probably, I don't know, hundreds of thousands, maybe a million people wandering the streets of Medina Bay that day in 2001. So my first view of Medina Bay was a very special one, because I could see people from all over the world, and I could see that this was really a global phenomenon. But then I stayed there for about 3 months in 2001. That was my kind of exploratory research.
Inshallah.
And it was maybe during the first week of research there that my research assistant, who Professor Usman Khan put me into contact with, by Chiam, he was mentioning leaders that I could go speak with, because I was interested in interviewing leaders. And one of the leaders that he mentioned was a woman, Jennifer Gay. And I said, oh, that sounds like a woman's name. And he said, yeah, it's a woman. And I said, well, are there a lot of women leaders? He said, well, I don't know. There are a few. I don't know them very well. But he didn't seem to be perplexed by the idea that we're women leaders. But this really surprised me, because I'd read a lot of literature about West African leadership, Islamic leadership, and I'd never heard of a single case of a woman. It turns out that some people had written about the case of Sokhna Maguette Diop, who was a Baifal leader in Chess, but I wasn't familiar with that one at that time. So I decided to look into this more, and she was presented as this very exceptional figure that was different from anyone else, and who had kind of broken the rules because her father didn't have a son to transfer his authority to. But what I saw with the women I was seeing, so I started over the following few years, I started seeing more women leaders. And the thing that really struck me about this phenomenon that even to this day, I have not seen anywhere else, was that these women, well, there were kind of two kinds of women who were authorities. One of them were the daughters of Sheikh Ibrahim and a few other major figures. And you do see this in other parts of the world. You do occasionally see a woman who is the daughter of a major leader, who is trained, who sometimes represents the Sufi tariqa, who sometimes represents, teaches knowledge. So this is not unique to the Fayda Tijaniya, although it was unusual that Sheikh Ibrahim had so many daughters. So it wasn't just like one. Usually you hear a case of one or two daughters. Here he had many daughters who were highly trained, who were writing books, who were known around the world. Sheikha Maryam as a Quran educator, Sheikh Ruqayya as an author of books. So this was unique. But the second thing that I found was unique was that the vast majority of women that I found who were appointed as leaders in the Tariqa Tijaniya, the Fayda branch, the vast majority of them were not the daughters of leaders. The vast majority of them did not come from a background where they were from an early age taught in the Islamic ulum, in the sciences of Islam. These were women who had become part of the Fayda through their own stories, often led there through dreams and visions and such. And they had come to be prominent disciples, and then they received an ijazah to represent the tariqah. And then the other thing that was very unique about them is that they all had male and female disciples. So if you look, the women outside the Fayda Tijaniya, almost in every case, they are either not really exercising authority in public, or they're only exercising authority for other women in order to maintain a kind of segregation. So men go to a male leader, women go to a female leader. And I found that in the Fayda Tijaniya, young men were going to these women for tarbiyah, to take the wird, for spiritual and religious instruction. So this was a unique phenomenon, and I haven't seen this anywhere else. So it was because I just saw this phenomenon that I hadn't seen anywhere else that I said, maybe I should be studying this. I had no interest from the beginning in women and gender issues and things like that. But the fact that this was a new phenomenon that I had never seen anyone talk about anywhere else, that led me to say, maybe I should do more research on this and ask those difficult questions of why this exists here and why I haven't seen this elsewhere, and what is unique about what's happening here. And I should mention that when I started my research, in 2001, again, I was interested in Islam because people in Senegal were interested in Islam. And I found it to be a colorful, interesting part of Senegalese culture. I had no interest in Islam as a religion, as a spiritual practice on a personal level. And it was only in 2012 that I actually, after 11 years of researching this movement, of researching the Fayda Tijaniya, that I became a Muslim. And it was only in 2016, so very recently, that I actually took the wird, the Tijani wird. So this was for a long time I was studying this and writing on it as a non-Muslim observer.
MashaAllah, so beautiful. I think your story also sort of the same as Professor Zakri, right? Too. I think he went to Senegal. He wasn't a Muslim, but after met Sheikh Hassan and all the shuyukh there, he became Muslim. Subhanallah, amazing. And this is totally something that the world hasn't known yet. And hopefully through this interview, people will try to learn and understand. But even for myself and my wife, we went, I think, to Senegal, for ziarah, visit Sheikh Mahi and also Sheikh Ibrahim Nias. I think I can't exactly remember. I think it was 7 years ago, the first time me and my wife went, and I think it was a total something different for both of us, mashallah. Even on the first day itself, we arrived late because from Singapore to Senegal, I think we need to transit a few places, or it's a matter of which airline you choose. So total is like 25 hours before we reach Madinah by Kaulap. So we were tired, and Sheikh Mahi, we arrived midnight. So Sheikh Mahi was saying that, both of you, Fajar, you just rest. Fajar, you pray in the mosque, and then tomorrow morning, sorry, Fajar, you pray in the room, you rest, and after that, we do ziarah. So after we finish everything, so a murid of Sheikh Mahi knocked on our door and said, "Oh, come, let's go to the mosque." And because Sheikh Mahi daily routine is to ziarah after he finished his wirid in the morning. So the first thing that we came in, and we saw quite a number of shuyukh, the Mauritanian and so on. And then my wife was there, and they said, sit, you know, in the front area of the mosque. So it's it's a bit awkward for my wife because in our region, our culture is something different. So that was an eye opening in the beginning of how they treat women. So it's really something else, I would say.
Mhm.
And from that moment, we felt this is it's a special thing in Senegal, and I mean in Medina by how they treat everything, and we learn how Sheikh Ibrahim has speak highly of women,
Mhm.
and saying that women should upgrade themselves, progress in the path, compete with men, knowledge and spiritual. So how is it that while you were doing all this research and later on you became Muslim, but before that, how was the experience transcend you or transform you? You know, from the West, how they see women in Islam and how you experience itself in
Mhm.
Senegal. Yeah.
Yeah. So um, you're right. I mean, going to Medina Bay and experiencing it is a very different experience. And I think there is something when you're there, there is something that comes over you. There is a very powerful sense of spirituality, um, of connection to something. And at the moment, I didn't know what the divine was, or I wasn't sure. I came from a Christian tradition that sees things very differently. So it's true that it's very different, but it's also very different from other Muslim places you might visit. There's a very different mindset, and there is a strong division of labor between men and women, and a strong even spatially women can enter into spaces that are predominantly men's spaces on occasion, but it's not something where all the spaces are mixed. So during prayer time, of course, the women are going to sit in their own section. Like my wife also came to Medina Bay with me in 2014, and after the prayer is over, like after the Tarawih prayers, we were there during Ramadan. She was able to come into the main part of the mosque and to walk around and talk to people, and there wasn't this sense that women couldn't go in anywhere. And also at the darih, at the when people are doing ziyarah, anyone can go in there, and there is this sense that women are participating, and some of the turuq that I've seen, men are the ones who are doing the scholarly work or who are representing tariqah. And when women are participating, they're participating more on a spiritualistic level. They might go, they might even have the dreams and the things like that of the sheikh, but they're not participating in the actual rites of the tariqah. They're not participating in many cases, in the actual, the litanies, the group litanies of the tariqah. And that's one thing that women in the Tijaniya, especially the Faida Tijaniya, women participate in all the litanies. There have even been some controversies, some divisions. I've heard of some disagreements among the muqaddams of Sheikh Ibrahim about whether all of the asrar, all of the litanies, all of the various awrad can be given to women, and some of them believe that they could not. But the people who were closest to Sheikh Ibrahim said, no, this is not a debate. Sheikh Ibrahim said that all women have access to everything spiritually. So it is true that you find women doing different things. This is West Africa. They're following an understanding of the division of gendered labor. So women are generally the ones who are cooking. You don't find men very often cooking. You don't find men changing babies' clothes very often. So there is a division of labor when it comes to household chores. But when it comes to religious things, women are supposed to go to the Quranic school. They're supposed to go to the Dara. Now, some families will take their daughters out earlier than the sons because they need them around the house to help with the cooking and cleaning and so on. But that's not an officially, they're not supposed to, officially, they're supposed to study the same amount as boys. There's no doctrine that says women are not supposed to study the same as boys. And like you said, Sheikh Ibrahim said, يا أيها البنات زاحمنا على نيل العلا فأما بأبدان فلا. Oh, this could be interpreted daughters or girls, uh, you know, compete for the highest of all of places, not for the middle or the lower places, but for the highest of places. But in bodily things, but not in bodily things. In other words, we're not trying to, and this is one difference between, I come from an academic environment in which, uh, certain notions of feminism are very widespread. And I think a lot of people would hear that from a feminist perspective and say, well, this is wrong because women should be the same as men bodily and spiritually and in everything. And I think from certain perspectives, women, of course, should have the same. If there are two people applying for a job, of course, they should have the same consideration. You shouldn't say, well, let's take the man because men are better. But but there's also a stigma sometimes of women who say, I want to perform certain roles that are, God has actually given me the ability to do certain things very well. And I want to focus my efforts on those kinds of things. I think this is the kind of thing that he's talking about there, that women actually have capacities to give birth and to raise children and to nurse children. They have certain nurturing capacity. And the woman that I talk to, they are very proud of the fact that they apply those same capacities to spiritual leadership. So that's kind of the central concept of this book, that women are actually using typically feminine behaviors to do roles that sometimes are defined as male roles, but they're not necessarily male roles. And they're not trying to say we can do it in exactly the same way as the men. They're saying we actually have our own special way of doing it that is in some ways better than what the men are doing. We can actually guide people better than how men are guiding people. So I'm actually going beyond the question that you've asked me and into a different territory here. But you're right. It's a very, and this is, for years I was going to Medina Bay and seeing that, being very impressed by a lot of what I saw there, but I couldn't quite participate because I wasn't a Muslim and I hadn't taken that step to become a Muslim. Yeah, go ahead.
I mean, I think you share a lot of gems, a lot of interesting facts that we are missing in this modern world today about how women should be and how their place is. But your own experience, right, in Medina Bay and what you had shared with us, how do one see then when you came back to the reality of your life? That means you go back to your origin, whether you're from Europe, Asian, or even America. So how can one really understand that woman does play an important role in society, and
Mm-hmm.
how do we embody it? You get what I mean? As in, like, how can we, how I try to rephrase the question, how can we, the woman, really benefit from the spiritual path and understanding their role, that they are there to contribute massively to the development of society too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think it's actually kind of a thorny question in a sense, because it's very hard to know, for many people to know, when you go to Medina Bay, how much of what you see there can you actually take back and do wherever you are. Because I think I'm living in Canada right now. I'm originally from the United States, but I'm living in Canada with my wife and my two kids. And there are certain things that are the way things are done in Medina Bay that I think couldn't actually be done uh, elsewhere. And actually, you find that people who go from Medina Bay, who are Senegalese themselves, who are committed, murids of Sheikh Ibrahim, when they go to other parts of the world, they will themselves adapt to the practices of wherever they're living. So I think there's a certain amount of, if you look at the surface phenomenon of which tasks are done on a daily basis by men and women, a lot of that, I think, has a lot to do with custom, with tradition, the fact that people are coming from an agrarian society where people were farming the fields, and you had to have a certain division of labor in order to do that. And I think you have to look at what is the kernel of kind of truth that can be actually taken from one place and applied to another. Like, for example, working outside the home, doing economic work outside of, actually every woman I know in Senegal does economic work for money in addition to their house. So it's not like, even though they're doing these traditionally feminine occupations, nobody is actually just saying the husband is providing for the family and I'm not doing anything economically. So it's not like, but they're doing it in the fashion that is relevant to the society that they live in. That would be very hard for some of them to get a job in a bank, because they would have to leave the household and the kinds of responsibilities they have there. Here in the West, where I live, it's a lot easier for women to not be at home all day, because there are things for the kids to do during the day. And meal preparation is relatively easy, because they don't have to sit there and pound the millet and make the couscous and do all these very labor intensive things that are done in Senegal. Somebody has to do that. And so that, over the years, they've decided women are the ones doing that because men are busy doing other things. So I think you have to be very careful about saying, we have to emulate that model of day-to-day operation. But on a spiritual level, the women who are pounding the millet and doing, a lot of people would go there from the West and say, oh, these women are oppressed because they're here doing the kitchen stuff, they must not participate in the religious life. But the fact is that every woman I knew in Medina Bay who was a part of that community, just about all of them above the age of 16 or 17 had gone through tarbiyah, had a sheikh who they would talk to regularly, were continuing in their spiritual progression, regardless. And so that's I would say this is what is truly unique in what I've seen about the Fayda Tijaniya, that Sheikh Ibrahim said that that ma'rifah and participation in the tariqah is absolutely independent of what kind of work you do, whether you're a man or a woman. He said that on numerous occasions. It doesn't matter what. And so and traditionally in many turuq, all turuq allow some kind of participation from people kind of on a peripheral level. You can go to the big, there'll be big gatherings where people go to get barakah, for example. So you have people who are called murids, and you have people who are called muhibbin or something like that. Sometimes you have people who are the lovers of the tariqah who are not really participating. And women were usually in that latter category. There were people who didn't formally participate, but they go and they hang on and they get barakah from the sheikh. And of course, Sheikh Ibrahim has barakah, and people do seek his barakah. But people don't. But this is often an excuse for not actually participating. Saying you can go and get barakah from the sheikh is often a way of saying you can't actually participate in ma'rifah and extending your knowledge and learning about the tariqah. All you can do is sit there from afar and get the barakah. And what I've seen that is, from what I can tell is unique about the Fayda Tijaniya, is that on a massive level, millions of people, regardless of their station in life, whether they are street sweepers, physicists at a university, politicians, farmers, housewives who are selling mangoes from a basket under their bed, not in the marketplace, those who go to the marketplace, it doesn't matter. Kids going to school even, they're all going through this tarbiyah process and going and doing their tarbiyah and consciously and constantly being part of a community, not hanging on to the periphery, but actually being part of it. So that was one thing that really struck me, that it's not a movement to say, let's end all forms of gender differentiation and make women and men the same. Although men and women are the same in many ways, it was a movement that says, let's take people where they are in whatever line of work they are and help them to know their Lord, subhanahu wa ta'ala. So that's what I found was very, very unique. Now, as far as the actual everyday and sending girls to school, girls in Medina Bay are supposed to go to school. Many of them have gone through and have their back degree and are studying at the university. Many of them are actually becoming the breadwinners for their families, because if you're smarter than your brother, you go on to the university and your brother doesn't go. And then you're the one who's contributing, and nobody has ever been against. I mean, I'm not going to say nobody's ever been against that. This has not been something that is a stigma to the family, that the daughter is smarter than the son, so she's the one who goes on and goes to the university. There might be some opposition to that among some people, because there are certain people who hold on to certain traditional ideas, but this is not what Sheikh Ibrahim taught, and it's not what the shuyukh are teaching. So that's, I guess that answers that question. Sort of.
It's okay. MashaAllah, it's beautiful the way how you describe it, and interesting also at the same time about how we should not completely emulate it, but also understand women also have her own role and spiritually, and they have certain ways if they can contribute it. It's not necessarily like what you mentioned about the feminist movement and so on. It's actually very interesting, and I think a lot of people should look into it and try to understand, like Sheikh Ibrahim Nas always said that there's no different men and women because of the soul, and you should compete and learn, which I mentioned earlier. In regards to your book, Prof, it's very interesting. I think if I can show it clearly to the people out there watching, sorry, I show it. And I think after the introduction, you have an emerging urban youth movement, and the new Mukaddam, then dropping, of course, the authority, motherhood, metaphors, and then cooking up spiritual leadership. They say a woman voice is aura, or all they are very interesting, and something that people want to read and understand spiritually, right? And because a lot of times people say that spiritual but disregard the Sharia and so on, but I think this is something that is not what it is, and is within the reality of the Sharia and tasawwuf and
Right.
and leads to the greater understanding of ma'rifah, right? But I would just like to ask, starting, because now we talk, I mean, the issue is always women, and you begin after the introduction is an emerging urban youth movement,
Mhm.
and how is it linked to all these women and the youth thing that you begin with, yeah, in this book?
Yeah. This is really at the heart of the book. Is now we've talked a lot about Medina Bay so far in this interview, and but some people who read this book might be surprised that it's not really about Medina Bay. Very little of what I described takes place in Medina Bay. The book is really about Dakar, the capital of Senegal, and there's kind of a historical accident for that. I was writing a book where I was going to talk about all the women leaders in the fight that I knew, and it started getting too long. So I divided it in two, and I decided to put the material about Dakar into one volume and put the material about everything else into another volume. So the first volume to be published was about Dakar, and the rest of it is about Medina Bay and some other places, um, because I'd wanted to really focus on this book on this emerging movement, because what's happening in Dakar is a bit different from what's happening in Medina Bay to a certain extent. Um, and it does show you to what extent the surface phenomenon can change, but the internal phenomenon can be the same. So there is this difference, of course, that I talk about in the book that we're all familiar with, between Zahir and Batin meanings and realities of things. And people who say that the Sharia contradicts the Haqiqah are people who might have some knowledge of the study of Sharia from an outward perspective, but they haven't looked at what's behind it. Why do we have these rulings in the first place? And so the Haqiqah, yes, you're supposed to follow the Sharia, but then you find that in many cases the asbab, or the usul of the Sharia, you need to follow somebody who understands the usul of the Sharia, so that of the fiqh, so that you understand why certain things are being done in certain circumstances, because there's not always one ruling that can apply to something on a very external, superficial level. Sometimes there are several rulings that you can choose between, depending on the circumstances that you find yourself in, and you need somebody who's actually a wise person to know which one to take. And that's because and that's where it actually understanding what's behind it, and the batin realities actually help you to understand how to apply something. So in the case of the Fayda Tijaniya, the way that people do it in Medina Bay is sometimes it's a different lifestyle in Medina Bay than in Dakar to a certain extent. And in Dakar, but one thing that you find from the beginning is that Sheikh Ibrahim himself said that the Fayda, his movement, was a movement of young people. And you find this from the beginning. He started this movement when he was around in his 20s. People say he originally announced it in 1929, going into 1930. But he even was giving tarbiyah before that, in a less public way. So there were people who probably had tarbiyah from him in the mid-20s, long before he founded Medina Bay, and who had ijazas from him. And that means he was in his 20s when he was teaching these things. So he was a young man. This is why they thought he was so impolite, because he was doing things that nobody else was doing as a young man, and they wanted him to sit down and be quiet because he was the younger son of his father. But from the beginning, his disciples were people younger than himself. So you can imagine if he was in his mid-20s going into 30s, the older members of his family and his father's discipleship didn't want to follow him because he was a very young guy, and they wanted to show respect to his older brother, Muhammad al-Khalifa. So even those who knew what his maqam was didn't want to show the lack of adab of leaving the older people and going with him. So some of them even had their younger siblings. They said, go study with Sheikh Ibrahim. He's the guy who knows. And so you had his close disciples were people younger than him. So it started out as this very young movement, young, very exuberant people who were very convinced by what he had to teach. And it was the same thing, Mauritanian. It was the younger members of the Mauritanian families who came and became his disciples, people like Sheikhani, and so on, Muhammad al-Mishri, and so on. And that has continued to this day. So of course, if you go to a Mawlid, the people sitting at the very front of the tent are going to be people who are a bit older. They're not necessarily youth, but the people who are actually gathered around are very largely youth. And they continue to be the ones who drive the movement, who make it grow. And the older people kind of take a step back as the younger people are the ones organizing everything. So but in Dakar, what you find that I talk about in the first chapter, the emerging youth movement, you find that there are a lot of young people who are going to Dakar seeking opportunities, kind of leaving their nuclear family, their father and mother, maybe living with extended family in Dakar, or maybe on their own, or maybe living with friends, or whatever living arrangements they can find, maybe just acquaintances they met. Now, they don't have the same kind of family structure in Dakar that they had where they came from, and they really need a sense of community and a sense of leadership. And so a lot of these young people are not from the Faida, they're not from Faida families. And one thing that they find is that the leaders in Dakar provide them with a sense of direction. They provide them with a sense of guidance in kind of this uncertain, the sea of uncertainty, against the waves and the winds that they're up against in Dakar. And there's a lot going on in Dakar that they might not morally agree with. And so, so the Faida has provided a very, very attractive alternative for youth who come from maybe other turuq. So most of the youth I knew, they were from either some of the other branches of Tijaniya or the Muridiyya or other turuq, or they didn't have a tariqah to begin with. And they had never really experienced tariqah life in those other ones. They had never been given a wird or anything. So they're looking for leadership. Now, women have acted as leaders in the Tijaniya since the beginning, since before the Faida. There have been a lot of women who have had ijazas, who have been recognized as spiritual women. So we shouldn't get the idea that women are, it's only the Faida that does this, but what's unique about what's happening in Dakar is that women are becoming the spiritual guides for very large numbers, dozens or hundreds of young men and women. And one of the things in my chapter, Motherhood, Metamorphosis Metaphors, it's about women who metamorphose from being biological mothers to being spiritual mothers. And the metaphor of motherhood, which goes back to early Sufis, it's been around for a long time, even in the absence of women actually doing it. The motherhood metaphor is kind of, people use that metaphor to describe the relationship between sheikh and disciple without, any women being involved. But for women, this metaphor is very powerful because, in fact, it goes beyond being just a metaphor. When we think of metaphor, we think of something that's not literally true, but is only, an image to help you understand a different truth. But they actually perceive their leadership as a form of motherhood. So it's only metaphorical to a certain extent, but to a large extent, it's not metaphorical. They see it as literal spiritual motherhood. So Sayyidah Musa Korombai, very interesting woman who's also a business person, very successful entrepreneur, public figure. She appears on TV to talk about fashion and all kinds of things. She sells skin care products and so on. And so you might think, well, she would be just a typical feminist who just, because she's an entrepreneur, she's going to get rid of all her traditional roles. But she's built her life around the notion that she is a mother. And where you have a lot of young people seeking guidance, this is a very powerful metaphor. And the young people actually really eat that up. They love that because they could use a mother figure in their life. So at first I thought that these young men would be very hesitant to go to a woman for spiritual guidance, because if you're in a culture where the most important person in your family, in your life, maybe after your mother and father, or maybe even before your mother and father, is your spiritual guide, don't you think that if you're in a society that is very patriarchal to a certain extent, wouldn't a young man feel ashamed to give that role to a woman? That's what I kind of thought. I kind of thought these are traditional African men. Maybe they would be ashamed to choose a woman. This is a role you can choose. You can choose anyone. You can choose, the most lofty, educated, Azhar educated man. But a lot of young men were going to these women for spiritual guidance, and it kind of puzzled me. And the way they're imagining the spiritual guide is as a mother, as somebody who's giving them motherly advice. And then even Sayyidah Musa Gorambai describes the process of tarbiyah almost as a process of childbirth, where you're almost experiencing the labor pains of delivering this young spiritual being into the world, somebody who's physically born but not spiritually. So it's through this tarbiyah process that they become spiritually born as new beings who are connected to Allah and His Messenger, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So it was through using, so in Dakar, this role is very highly sought after. People really, it's something that there's a market for it, you might say, if you want to use social scientific language. There's a market for this kind of leadership now, because there's so many young people who are kind of drifting around seeking community.
Inshallah, beautifully explained, Prof. Um, in regards to woman leadership and Mukaddam and Sheikha, who do you met for this book to interview? Just now you mentioned earlier you met some of Sheikh Ibrahim's daughter and some other who are not, but they are also spiritual leader. Who do you met and what do you think of them to the point that you wrote this book also, and how much they had, I would say, influenced your life or empowered your soul? Yeah.
Yeah, this is a very good question. Um, yeah, and in answering that question, I might have to step back and talk about the larger project, because many women who I interviewed did not actually make it into this book, because I had to select a few examples to keep her from getting too. You see, it's over something like 300. It's around 300 pages.
Allah.
It would have been 600 pages if I had talked,
Allah.
and some of them I'm saving for the second volume. And I decided
Allah.
to go that route because I instead of this, like, doing a statistical study where I reduce everybody down to a population and talk about most of them said this, I decided to actually share their stories. So I go into a lot of detail about the stories that they told me and my observations. So there are a lot of women because of that who didn't make it into the book. But I met a large number of women, mostly just in Senegal. I haven't actually, many people tell me that I should go to Nigeria and other parts of West Africa to interview the daughters of Sheikh Ibrahim who are in those countries. But so far, I've only met the ones in Senegal and to a lesser extent those in Mauritania. Um, so yeah, I interviewed for the larger project. I interviewed, and there's a chapter about Sheikha Maryam that is published in a different book. You can actually find it on my Google site. So
Hmm.
I interviewed Sheikha Maryam, and I was able to find out things, have her tell me things about her life that people even who are very close to her had not heard her say, because she hadn't really necessarily told them all the stories. So some of those stories make it into that chapter, and I'm expanding on that chapter for my second book, inshallah. And then I also interviewed Sayyidah Ruqayya several times, and also her children. So I most recently in 2018, just 2 years ago, I interviewed her to kind of follow up on some of the questions I had. I've talked to her several times. I spent a lot of time in Sheikh Mariam's house, just she's a lovely person to be with. So just going there, having iftar with her and the people around her. I also interviewed people who were close to her, like and also women who were founding figures of the Faida movement in Dakar. So like Sera Harin Jai, who was probably the first muqaddama to give tarbiyah in Dakar, that in a way that's visible by others. I'm not sure if there are others before that. And then her friend Astur Job, Allah yarhamaha, who had a stroke and passed away just maybe a year or two ago. I just learned that a few months ago because I met her children, or her. I met Jana Job's children and Harin Jai's children in Boston, and so very interesting women. Awa Sise, who was the also happens to be the wife of Malau Kamara, who I'm not sure if he's still the president of Ansaruddin Dakar, but he was the president of Ansaruddin Dakar for several years, and he was the last one that I knew when I was doing research there. And so she has her own gathering of disciples out in Wakam, and so this is an interesting situation. Her and Seda Harin Jai, both of them are women whose husbands were very active in the Faida, very well-known figures in the Faida community, and yet it was in those couples, it was the woman who was actually given the ijazah, and their husbands actually had ijazahs too, but they didn't actually use them to do tarbiyah. So it was the woman who actually was the one who was known as the muqaddam. So nobody knew that their husbands had ijazahs. It was the women who actually were the ones giving the tarbiyah. There's also the woman on the cover of the book, one of the youngest muqaddamas that I interviewed, Sayyidah Zainab Mbaid, who is in one of the Dakar neighborhoods inside the city. Many of them are operating in the suburbs as well. Magad Nyang, Nde Magad Nyang, who has disciples over kind of in the Liberté 6 area, who was a follower of Bai Mukhtar Ka, who I feature in the last chapter of the book. And also in the last chapter of the book, I should mention, I also, because I think when we're talking about women, it's important not just to talk about men, but they're also women, but also their relationships with men. So I also have a chapter about a woman who is the only figure I knew who was the wife of a major muqaddam, most of these women are operating pretty independently of their husbands. But here's somebody who is the wife of a major muqaddam, and then she ends up exercising many of the leadership functions because he is so much of an ascetic who is kind of in his own spiritual world that he needs somebody to kind of take care of the day-to-day operations. So she's the one who is actually taking care of the details of tarbiyah and leading the community and so on, because he's kind of he's much more of a khalwa kind of guy, and she's much more of a being out there, which is kind of reverses the role, because usually we think of women as being the ones who are enwrapped and enclosed and not as visible, and the men as being the ones who are out in public. And she kind of reverses that role. Her husband is the one who is wrapped and enclosed, and she's the one who is very visible face of the community. Many others. I mean, I interviewed probably, I actually don't have a count right now, but I interviewed at least 25 women
MashaAllah.
who are appointed as
25. Wow.
something like that. There's also another interesting one that I talk about, two of them that I talk about in the later chapter are the zakirat, the Aidafai, Sayyida Aidafai, and then another one who is really the pioneer of women's dhikr performance, Harin Jai, who has, since I interviewed her, got an ijazah. She wasn't a muqaddama at the time, but since then she has an ijazah and has started her own daira of people to whom she's given the wird and tarbiyah. So when the book, I don't mention that because that's a very recent development. But that's one of the paths through which people become muqaddamas, is through becoming a dhakira or sikarkat. And it brings them to the attention of the leaders, and they get pointed in that way.
MashaAllah. I think you blew me away with all your experience. MashaAllah. 25 you had interview. Allah. Also in regards to, like, there's one chapter you put up, cooking up spiritual leadership, and you also mentioned about how some of the mukaddam, their wife, involved and some are not involved. I think this is very beautiful, and it goes back to our earlier discussion in sense that if women can contribute, so be it, and if they don't, they still have a role to play behind the scene. Yeah. Uh, Coming forward to another chapter is called, I think everybody uh, wanting to know is the aura. Everywhere you go, a woman aura is the voice and all that. While you are doing this, I think we want to hear you yourself. I mean, your experience on these issues. The aura part of woman is the voice and so on. What was your take on it through the Faida or your Madina Bai experience on it that you wrote in this book also?
So this is a question that I was a little bit confused about for a long time, because I wasn't sure to what extent it was an official teaching that the woman's voice is aura. And if it was an official teaching, what did that actually mean in practical terms? Because in many situations that you see traditionally, people believe that, and it is actually written. I actually mentioned this in a conference once to Islamic in the West, to Islam people, many people who are studying Islamic legal questions, and many of them were actually unfamiliar with the idea that a woman's voice is aura, which kind of surprised me, and it made me think, well, maybe this is just a cultural practice that people have. But then I looked further and I found that it actually is. It's literally found, like in the Bughiyat al-Mustafid, it actually says that women's voices are aura, which is why, which is one of the, for those who don't know, it's considered one of the main books of the Tariqah, because it's a commentary on the Munyat al-Murid, which itself is considered to be an authoritative reflection of the practices of the Tariqah. So it's explaining why women don't, for example, lead the wadifa, and why they don't recite it too loudly. And it's actually recommended that they recite it not out loud, but quietly. Although you do go to wadifas and you can hear women reciting it more or less quietly. But it's usually women are not trying to drown out the men or be very loud. And this actually goes back to, so this is known as a question of fiqh tariqah. And the fiqh tariqah is actually based on fiqh of the deen. because it's almost analogous. It's kind of analogous to the questions of prayer. For example, the same ruling is had in prayers, that in the salah, in the Fajr and Maghrib and Isha salah, the men are going to recite the first the ayat of the first two rakas out loud, and the women do not. And there are other cases in which a man will speak out loud and a woman will not speak out loud. Like, for example, in correcting the imam or something, when a mistake is made, a man can actually recite say the words, the prompt with the right words, and a woman might, I think, clap her hands or something. I'm not a faqih, so I'm scraping the bottom of my memory for these things. And so these rulings that are found in the fiqh books that go back to hadith and so on are taken together to say that, well, the reason why women don't do that is because their voice is awra, and also the fact of the iqama. Women don't necessarily recite the iqama out loud before praying, whereas men do in the Maliki tariqah and other Maliki madhab. I'm not sure what the practice in other madhabs is, whether they're supposed to recite the iqama before an individual salah, but in Maliki madhab, you're supposed to do the iqama. Men are, but women are not. So this is extended in the fiqh tariqah to say that women are not supposed to speak, do the wadifa out loud and the hadrat al-jum'ah out loud. And this is often accompanied with the explanation that the reason why they're not doing that is because women's voices, just like you shouldn't see a woman's naked body or a body that is not sufficiently covered, and a woman shouldn't show that publicly. A woman also should not show her voice publicly, because the voice, just like the body, can be incite people to passions. It can be undignified to expose publicly, and therefore, in order to maintain maximum dignity of a woman, so that she's not sexualized or seen by strange men in a sexual way or in an undignified way, that women should not be out there letting their voices be heard. Now, this is, and that has led to many, many cultural practices that women are generally just not, their voices are not heard in public. They're not given the microphone to speak in meetings very often. They're not out there giving a lot of public speeches. And then traditionally, until recently, they did not practice the dhikr publicly in a meeting where they would actually recite the dhikr. And there are anecdotes that I've heard about Sheikh Ibrahim himself in which he discouraged women from publicly reciting dhikr, but I've heard lots of explanations about whether that's applicable today. So after looking into whether this is an official position and whether the main shuyukh of the tariqah accepts this position that the woman's voice is awra, I found that the understanding today is actually very complex. Whereas traditionally it was very often understood to mean a woman cannot speak in any public capacity at all. Now it's much more often interpreted as women should not speak in a way that incites people's passions. But if she's speaking in a way that does not incite passions or incite to bad behavior or bad thoughts, then a woman can speak publicly and take the microphone or chant dhikr. So Aidafai is probably, in Senegal generally, even among non-disciples of Sheikh Ibrahim, non-Faida people, she's probably the best known sikarkat, the best known reciter of dhikr, male or female, Tijani or Murid, hands down. Like, she's the one who, if you're walking across Dakar, she's the one whose voice you're most likely to hear. Some people might dispute that. They might say that, well, maybe some of these Baifal chanters are better known for singing the Qasaid of Ahmadu Bamba. But I think she's the one who, walking around Dakar, whose voice I heard more than anybody else. Now, does that go against the rule of a woman's voice being awra? I talked to her and I talked to many people about this, and I actually got divided opinions. Some people said, yeah, maybe she shouldn't technically be out there doing that. But the good that comes of her doing that is greater than the bad. And so therefore, it's something that can be overlooked. And other people said, no, when other people appealed to kind of haqiqa reasoning to say that when you get to a knowledge of Allah, then the forms of male and female no longer are even relevant. That she is, when she is reciting, she's not actually conscious of her being a woman, and the people who are hearing her are not conscious of her being a woman, and therefore people don't, that when there's no consciousness of being a man or a woman, then the ruling no longer applies. So I've heard a lot of different arguments about that. Some people who are a bit more Sharia minded say, well, it doesn't matter what state of mind you're in. When she's performing, she still wears her malahfa. Actually, she covers even more than she would in her everyday life. So in other words, she's very, very well covered when she's doing that. And so if she were completely unaware of being a woman, then she might not be as careful to cover in that way. So you could make arguments about for and against the fact that she's doing that. But one precedent, an important precedent, came from Sheikh Ibrahim that now people can use, and that is that he actually asked his daughter Sheikha Ruqayya, when she was a very young woman and not married yet. Actually, no, I think she might have been just married at that time, but she was probably in her late teens or 20 or so. He asked her to speak inside the Mawlid meeting. And this was something that nobody had ever heard of before, of a woman actually taking the microphone and addressing a gathering of hundreds of thousands of people. And so this shows that Sheikh Ibrahim saw that when it came to questions of Islamic knowledge, if a woman was teaching knowledge to people who did not have that knowledge, then it was actually required for her to do so. And so this set a precedent that if a woman is actually doing something that's very positive and what she's teaching is positive, then that outer rule doesn't seem to be applied. Now, I'm sure people could get into the details about does that follow Sharia or not, but I think Sheikh Ibrahim's view on it was that if the good that comes from it is, and then the same thing, she told me the story of when she went to, I think it was Sierra Leone, it says in the book, to give and there was a group of people who came and said, we want to and she was with a group of Tijanis and Muslims, local Muslims, and there was a group of people that wanted to convert to Islam, become Muslims that day. And they asked her to give a speech at this meeting that was welcoming them into Islam. And so she took the mic. I think she was actually going to speak. And then the local leader said, you shouldn't speak because you're a woman and the women's voice is awra. And later she told Sheikh Ibrahim about that. She said, they asked me to speak, but then I didn't because the local leaders told me not to. And he said, oh, you've made a mistake. You should have spoken, because any sin that would have occurred through kind of going against that norm would have been greatly compensated by the fact that what you were teaching them was more important than not opening your mouth. So it's for Sheikh Ibrahim, it seems that it's a question of weighing the good and evil that comes. If a woman is going to incite people's passions, then she should not speak. If she's going to teach knowledge, then she should. But of course, I mean, this is something we could go on for a very long time about. I'm an academic, this is our job. We talk for hours about that, and we wouldn't actually completely settle which cases are allowed and which cases are not. But that seems to be the general principle.
MashaAllah, Prof. I think this is very interesting for us to learn and understand the different perspectives have its own benefits. And I think scholars also have different opinions on it. And I think we should be more receptive and engage in a manner that we understand that it has some benefit for certain social. Of course, like what you mentioned, certain culture have its own role and have its own ways of doing things. But nevertheless, this is something that I think a lot of us are learning from you actually. In this issue, mashallah. Thank you very much. I have one question from someone. Just now you're mentioning about how this woman who are doing khidmah, I forgot her name, but the husband is more of a khalwa type, and they are more dominant in society. So one viewer asking, uh, some women, perhaps because of their culture too, may find it hard to be spiritual leaders. And interestingly, you met this woman whose husband support them in their role as guides. Can you share with us your experience when talking to the spouses of these women leaders?
Well, this is an excellent question. Yeah, and I think, and one thing I want to preface that with is that I think some people might come away from this book thinking that I'm saying that, there's this argument, especially in the West, and I think among Muslims themselves, about are women in Islam oppressed and are they in need of liberation? And a lot of people, so you get this response that yes, Islam is an oppressive women, all Muslim women are oppressed all the time. And then you get this other response from, I think, what you could call apologists of Islam who say, oh no, women in Islam are totally free, they're totally happy, there are no problems of gender problems in Islam, that's all the Western colonial conspiracy, everything is just great. And I don't think either of those is really a useful response. I don't think it's useful to say, no, women are totally free or women are totally oppressed. I think actually a lot of oppressive practices happen in Islamic communities and Muslim communities. And I don't think that being a member of the Faida necessarily automatically liberates women from husbands who actually I was just talking to. I've had conversations recently with people who are part of the Faida community women whose husbands have treated them in really horrible ways, who claim to be knowers of Allah and who are extremely unfair to their wives. So this is, I think, and I didn't really say this as explicitly as maybe I could have in the book, that I am not making a claim that Faida women are totally happy and liberated all the time and their husbands are always supportive of them. That is not the case. You very often find these cultural ideas creeping in that say women, no, you can't do that, you can't do this, and you have to stay home and cook and don't go out and study or and so on. The women, that said, every one of the women that I studied, that I interviewed for this book, either had a husband who was extremely supportive of them, and the husbands actually saw them as bringing something positive to their lives. They didn't see this as something detracting from their authority. They saw it as something that they liked the idea that their house had become a hub of activity, that young disciples were coming in all the time. They trusted there was never a question of impropriety with disciples, because usually the women were older than the disciples, considerably older, and there were enough people around that there was never an idea that something inappropriate was happening. Every husband I knew was extremely supportive. There are a few of these women who were divorced, and I think that could have to do with the fact that their husbands did not actually share a religious vision with them. One of them was married to a Salafi, and she herself was a Salafi when she discovered by Sheikh Ibrahim. So that would create problems, as you can imagine. Probably her Salafi husband is not going to appreciate her being a muqaddama or a sheikha. There were some one of them was divorced and did not have a husband at all. And then several had husbands who lived in some other city. So they were actually they didn't consider themselves estranged, and that they didn't describe their marriage as something where they had a problem with their husband. It's just that I happen to live here, he happens to live there, he visits occasionally. So they kind of were independent women. So and those are the positive cases. The fact that they're exercising authority, you can probably hear that there's a young Muslim woman in my house who is not happy right now.
It's okay, inshallah.
And those are the positive cases. So it kind of leads to the question, if I had done a study of broader women and not just those who are successful as leaders, would I find that some could have been successful leaders, but their husbands didn't let them? And I think that, yes, there probably are cases like that I didn't hear about, because nobody's going to say, oh, so-and-so is a potential leader, but her husband's not letting her do it. Nobody's going to say that. So I only, this is kind of a test, a case of only all positives. And I think maybe these are model cases for people who are wondering, can a husband support his wife in her religious mission? And in this case, all of them, and some of them even had one really prominent woman who's not actually a muqaddimah, but she was like one of the main organizers, Astu Job. Her husband, for a long time, she was married to a murid guy who was a member of a different tariqah, and she never had any problems with him. He always let her do her thing. And one of her conditions of getting married was, you have to let me, I think we're having a meltdown here. You have to let me go to the Mawlid and do all the things that I'm doing. So he understood, if I marry you, you're going to be a leading figure in this community. So yeah, I don't know if that answers your question, but hopefully.
It is, mashallah. I think we learn a lot because of the way how we deal things, and we need to understand. And I think your work, your research, and this book, actually, after going through with you almost an hour, I think we already passed an hour. I felt that it's very important how we understand social behavior, and also knowing that marriage has what we call it, a spiritual objective to achieve between therefore it is more than just a book on women. I think it's beyond that, and I think this book is very important for every woman to read and reflect their journey and understand their role completely. right? And it goes to the last few we thought like the aesthetic and the mother of Noah's, and you mentioning about meeting some mukaddam and some great woman of the tariqah, um, and how they change the way how you see things in life and how you look at the tariqah itself, right? What would you say on this chapter for all the people watching? And also at the same time, I'm trying to put in someone send a question, and I think it's quite relevant to this topic right now. It's like a woman who wants to be on the path to Allah, any path. What would your advice be through your experience uh,
Mhm.
doing this research, meeting uh, different women in Africa, West Africa, like you said, not necessary in Medina, but it can be any parts of maybe in Dhaka and so on. Yeah.
Yeah, this is an excellent question. I don't know if I have a really great answer for it, but I'll try. Um, I do think that a lot of people see that there's a conflict between that women are too busy with doing their various tasks, and that's why they leave those things to the men. And some women actually told me that, yeah, we're, Muslim women are too busy changing diapers and cooking dinner and things. And and I don't know, I don't want to set this up as an unrealistic expectation, but one of the women that I interviewed, Harin Jai, who is this great sikarkat, a great dhakira, performer of dhikr in public, her story, and many of them were very similar to this. She told me that she was nursing her child when she went through tarbiyah, and of course she had all kinds of, when you're nursing a child, you can be exhausted. You're doing all kinds of opportunity, all kinds of work around the house. It's not the time when you're freest with your time, but that's when she went through tarbiyah, and very soon after that, accumulated a lot of knowledge. Now me, I'm a man. I'm not nursing a child, obviously. Um, I find it hard to find time to do my dhikr in addition to the lazim. It's very hard to do and to study have time to study the Quran and everything. And one thing that these women showed me was that if you really put your mind to it and you're really committed to something, and I think it has to be a question of passion. You have to be passionately in love with Allah and His Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, um, to in order to kind of remain focused on the goal, which is not which is ultimately to know Allah and get closer to Allah and to be a servant of Allah that pleases Allah. And and one thing that they showed me is that it's possible to do that coming from all different kinds of circumstances. And this doesn't mean that it's equally easy for everybody. And it doesn't mean that there aren't cases that I overlooked because, they didn't jump out. Nobody recommended talking to the people who had a hard time with that. But one thing I noticed is that women who are going through the hardest of times, people who are going through divorces, going through rearing children, all kinds of struggles in their own lives, while they were doing those struggles, they were actually involved in doing all that they could, all the, um, they were able to, it was because they were passionately devoted to what they were doing. Um, and they didn't have to be, they were not Azharis, they were not people who were trained in the traditional schools. They were just ordinary women who were no different in any other way from anybody around them. And I think that's maybe one of the lessons that I've taken from this is that, if somebody who is from, and most of them are not, most of the one I'm talking about are from, actually had very difficult, most of them came from very ordinary Senegalese backgrounds, which means you're not rich. You're not very well off. A lot of them were selling, like they were taking care of their children while, like Abu Sodrame is another really interesting one, out in the suburbs of Dakar. Every day she would take the several buses downtown, that's a several hour ride downtown to sell food at a stand, carting her kids along with her. And then she would take the same buses back home. I mean, that is an exhausting life. Now, how you have time and energy to do dhikr on top of that, I don't know. But I have a hard time doing my class preparation and grading papers and doing all my getting my articles out by the deadline. Um, but the challenges I have are nothing compared to the challenges that these women have dealt with. You know, I think it shows that we can be in all kinds of circumstances and still be devoted to the task at hand. And that's what really struck me about the Fayda Tijaniya and the followers of Fayda Tijaniya, that they come from all these different backgrounds. And when you talk to them, it doesn't matter if you're, I mean, there is a difference between the way a scholar talks and the way an average disciple talks. But when it comes to the Ma'rifah Billah, whether you're talking to that housewife who lives out in the suburbs of Dakar in the really not privileged areas, or whether you're talking to somebody who is a prevalent entrepreneur, or whether you're talking to somebody who is actually a daughter of a sheikh who's well educated, the experience of Allah and the love for Allah and His Prophet ﷺ, and the dedication and the kinds of things that they say about Allah and their knowledge of Him are the same. They've all kind of reached this this kind of view from the mountain from which they're perceiving things, regardless of their background. And that's the really striking thing. And they're all and they all can tell you. Now, some of them are not totally open about their experiences, but from what you can tell, they've all had dreams of Sheikh Ibrahim, of various people, of various realities. They've, you know, these are people who are alive spiritually, regardless of how difficult their situations are. And some of them are living in very difficult situations. So maybe that's the take home that I maybe didn't emphasize as much in the book, because it was kind of a personal point of view and not so academic. But you know, that's kind of what has really struck me about all this and really made me think about my own life.
Inshallah. So beautiful, Prof. I think we come to an end, Prof. We nearly 1.5 hours. MashaAllah, we have a good time, a
Inshallah.
blessed time with you. There's a lot of, actually, there's a lot more we can talk about, and we can go like 5 hours also. And
Yeah.
it's very in depth. It's really in depth. And for those of you who wants to know about more in details on women on the spiritual path, I seriously recommend you this book. And it's available if you're in Singapore. It's available in Wardah. Even if you're not in Singapore, you can mail order at Wardah, and I'm sure Amazon may have it also.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think this is very important for today situation. And I think Professor Joseph write explicitly for us today to understand. I think the in depth of spiritual path, especially for women. I think he mentioned a lot about women have children, how they deal with it, and on the other aspect of a woman being someone who is vigorously social activist, but also ma'arifah billah, that kind of thing. And I think it's very rarely that we heard such word and understand such I would say terminology, but affect in real life experience, right?
Mm.
So we like to thank Professor Joseph for his time. He's still in the early hours in the morning over his time in Canada, and
Mhm.
we really truly appreciate his time. And I've been wanting to do this for so long, and finally we are able to do so. Thanks, Prof. And what are your last words for all those who are watching this live, and also those who will be watching after live because maybe they have something on? Yeah,
Mhm.
what will be your advice or anything you like to share with us before we end?
Alhamdulillah. So thank you for joining us, everyone. Jazakumullah khair, and Jazakallah khair, Sidi Khalid, for inviting me. It's really a pleasure to talk to you, and it's an honor for me to be invited here, and it's an honor to that people are listening and watching. And yeah, I think if by way of advice, I think I'm a humble servant who has very little to advise anyone. But I think what I do try to do is offer people examples of people who probably are in a better position than I am to advise and to inspire and to be examples. And I do think that the dedication and the mahabba and the shauq that I saw, the love and the passion that the women had, and the men as well, that I've interviewed, that I've spoken with, that's what I find truly inspiring, that it actually gets them up to do something, not to just feel it in their heart and that's it, but it actually gets them to it goads them to action. And with regards to the broader question that you raised about women in Islam, and I think the message goes out to men and women, to women, that you do have a potential to do all kinds of things, and you're, to a large extent, you're limited by your doubt about what you can achieve. To men, you are also a limiting factor for the women in your life, because if you believe that the women in your life around you don't have the potential to attain great things, then you can actually prevent them from achieving their highest capability. And I think that's one of the major obstacles that we have, that men don't see this potential in women to attain the greatest things, because they've been told through some cultural teaching that women don't have the same potential, which is absolutely not true. It is true that in many cases we have different roles. Many of those roles are, to a large extent, I'm teaching a class on gender, anthropology of gender right now, and we talk about how roles are to a large extent culturally defined, and a lot of things that we think are natural are not as natural as we might think they are. And it takes, in a relationship between a man and woman, like talking about marriage, it takes sacrifices on both parts. I think a lot of people think that only women should make the sacrifice. I think marriage is impossible without both people making sacrifices, and you should make sacrifices so that the women in your life can attain the highest things that they can attain, which ultimately is not really a sacrifice, because it comes back to you. We all benefit when we are all attaining our highest degree of accomplishment. So thank you very much. Jazakumullah khair.
Thank you very much for so much that we learned tonight from your experience, your knowledge, your wisdom, and your research work. We hope, we apologize for any inconvenience.
No, none at all, none whatsoever.
And we hope to work with you again soon, inshallah.
Inshallah.
Looking forward to it. May Allah preserve you. May Allah, envelop you in His love, your family. We see you again, inshallah. Take care.
Inshallah. May Allah accept your khidmah.
Ameen.
Thank you. Talk to you soon, inshallah. Assalamu alaikum.
Alhamdulillah, there was a very interesting, in-depth discussion, interview with the author of Rapping Authority on women's on the spiritual path, which is very interesting for today's society to learn and understand the role of, not only the role of gender, but also that women also are able to achieve certain spiritual height, inshallah. Right. So before we say good night to all of you, I would like to say that please contribute at any amount that you can afford to the building of the hospital for the poor in Senegal at Tibanias. Right, at any amount you can check it out. You can contribute at the link bit.ly/Senegal Hospital. I repeat again, it's at Launchgood, bit.ly/Senegal Hospital. Or you can PM our IG or Facebook. And tomorrow night, inshallah, is the continuation of Tafsir Quran of Sheikh Ibrahim by Imam Abdullah Andau. 10 p.m. Singapore, 10 a.m. in America, and also maybe in Europe it will be like 3 p.m. in UK, so on. So enjoy. Tomorrow will be Surah Al-Falaq and Surah Nas. So join us tomorrow, okay, to benefit, inshallah, the knowledge of the Arabillah. And here we said, may Allah preserve you in good health. May Allah ease your affairs and suffice your need. Remember us in your prayer. Thank you very much. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.